This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. I'm in Norfolk, Virginia for this week's episode of the podcast. Joining me is Eric Tennant from Benchtop. Welcome to the podcast, Eric.
Hello, thank you.
There's a big ska music festival happening down here in Hampton this weekend, and so I built a trip around it to go see old friend of mine, Ansis Perrins, and his band Skavuvi and the Epitones from Boston. Ansis, for the last 10 years, has also been the comic illustrator for Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. I met him back in the 90s, and he's been a big part of Craft Beer and Brewing for the last 10 years. No, this is year 11 now for us. And a bit of a creative contributor, and so I'm excited to reconnect and go see him get his band back together after 24 years here in Hampton. And so as I was thinking about, what do I do while I'm there? I'm making the trip down here, right? So we had a beer of the year last year.
Yeah.
Benchtop's Old Wooden Ship, a beer you all submitted to us, a barrel-aged barley wine right here in Norfolk, Virginia. And if I'm going to be there, might as well get a podcast done in the morning before we get that started. So thank you, Eric, for joining me.
Yeah, welcome.
Barrel-aged barley wine is not a huge part of any brewery's repertoire. It's a narrower thing, and so we're going to talk about your approach to making that barrel-aged barley wine our beer of the year. You also won a gold medal back in 2017 for an oyster goza of all things. But as we were talking, before we kicked this off, what you've really leaned into for the last few years is Foeder lager, and so we're going to talk about Foeder lager, barley wine, and then Foeder lager of all things, and kind of understand how you take that kind of Foeder lager approach to obviously differentiate from other styles of lager that are common out there in the market. And see where those points of similarity and points of difference end up. Before we do that, at G&D Chillers, they always strive to build great chillers. Partner with them as you build great beer, but don't just take it from me.
This is Andy Joint of Big Grove Brewery. We've been using G&D chillers from the beginning, and from our original 3.5 barrel pub system up to our production brewery, we've been able to rely on G&D to provide a high quality chiller, help us with design and layout, and provide support whenever we need it.
That's right. Choose G&D chillers on your next expansion or brewery startup and receive 1 free year of remote control and monitoring of your new G&D chiller. And ProBrew is excited to now offer 2 to 4 week lead times on all in-stock ProFill rotary can fillers and seamers. These models are available in 100 to 300 can per minute filling speeds and are built with a focus on scalability and low dissolved oxygen pickup. This special lead time is only while supplies last, so send them an email at contactus@probrew.com or call them at 262-278-4945. ProBrew, brew your beer. Also, Old Orchard has supplied flavored craft juice concentrate blends to over 46 states for the production of fruit-forward beer, cider, seltzer, wine, spirits, and more. By partnering with some of the biggest names in the craft brewing landscape, Old Orchard has become a go-to source of fruit-forward ingredients. To learn more and request your free samples, head on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. Eric, where do we start? Let's talk about your background. How'd you get into, what led you into craft beer, and then what led you into brewing? Tell us the Benchtop story.
Okay. Yeah. So I was a food scientist for about 20 years. Got a food science degree. I went into product development in the meat industry. So most everything I learned about fermentation, I learned on, development of pepperoni and salami and things like that. And so my job was a innovation manager, right? And that was my last job. I had, went from quality control to product development, different jobs throughout the years. But that one was basically, we take a concept, we figure out where there's a gap in the market. We feel like we do some consumer learning. We develop some prototypes. We test those with consumers. We tweak them. And then we eventually keep fine tuning that into where we scale up our, say, 50-pound pilot plant sample up to something that's like 10,000 pound batches being distributed all over the country. And so that was my job for 20 years. Started with ConAgra Foods, doing like Slim Jims and whatever. So went through that and eventually started making beer on the side, right? And kind of realized that it was like the same different medium, same process basically.
Sure,
so I started
sure.
really like digging into like,
I see the connection with the brand name now. Like,
right.
you know, you're building this holistic idea of this,
And so it's like the Benchtop, we say it's like the first iteration of a new prototype. So it's everything is to that like very detailed oriented focus that we try to bring as we scale up. I mean,
Sure.
we're still a fairly small brewery, 7-barrel brew house, but started that back in 2016.
Okay.
And
So you got the home brewing and then, you know, won some awards, I imagine. And,
yeah.
and then your friends said you should start a brewery.
Yeah. And so, you know, just like, it's not a unique story,
Sure,
going around to breweries and tap rooms and be like, you know, I think I can do this, you know? And so eventually I wrote a business plan that took me a lot longer than I thought, and everything cost a lot more than I thought. But eventually, the idea, the tasting room that was so intriguing to me was that I could kind of do my consumer learning and have people pay me to do it versus the other way around, you know? So like I could put out a new beer that we've
Right.
we've
You
developed.
can't sell your home brew, but if you can still do the creative work that you love doing, and you just have an audience that's going
Right.
to go along for the ride with you, and hopefully make a little bit of money on it in the process.
Yeah. And it allowed to, like a lot of entrepreneurs, I think, wanted to see what would it be like if I did it my way. Right. And so like, that creative outlet to make things the way that I wanted to make them. And so, started doing that. We, initially kind of focused more on, very creative kettle sours like the Oyster Goza.
Sure.
And we've done some stuff like beet beer, carrot beer.
2016, 2017 it feels like forever ago, but
Yeah.
we were so not jaded back then, right?
Right. And everything, you know, was
Sure.
felt, you know, that was new. Here's this new thing. And so
That was a way to also in that kind of market, you know, stake a claim for being new and creative and finding some different pathway and some reason for people to pay attention to a new brewery in the market.
Right. And that was kind of like our, you know, so we were focusing on that and really at that and IPA, we're really kind of like, I was a big fan of like, you know, the original, like the heady toppers of the, you know, those beers. And so we kind of developed our flagship IPA around some of those. And then we started doing some of the barrel aged beers. And that was kind of actually our first batch of Old Wooden Ship was the Barleywine was a pretty fun story. Like, and I guess I could go back to like my original favorite all time Barleywine was the King Henry Goose Island beer. You know, that where they aged it in the Pappy 23 barrels after they did the stout in them. And so and I tasted that and I was like, I want to do something that's in that arena. So we did our anniversary stout that we call Wicked Walter, and we aged it in maple syrup bourbon barrels for a year. And then we empty that, and then we fill it with the barley wine, and we age that for another year. And then, you know, package that, and then we actually empty that and then filled it with Oud Bruin, and that was the genesis of our Brown Bear Honey Pot Oud Bruin series. And so like we don't do that anymore, like 3 uses of a barrel very often, but it was kind of a fun thing to do. Yeah.
Talk about styles that people drink even less of than barley wine. Right. Now we're in Oud Bruin.
Yeah. So yeah, I tasted that first barrel that we did, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna buy a 15-barrel Foeder for Oud Bruin, and now, we sell not a ton of it, but it's like barley wine. It's a passion thing that we do, that we enjoy doing, and it's not that we're gonna make a lot of money on it, but it's something that we have a passion for. So.
Sure. Well, we did an episode earlier this year with Verzet, Alex from Verzet, on brewing Flemish red beer. And, we're still here for it, even if it's a small part of the market. And anyway, we'll keep all of these beautiful traditions alive. So you start the brewery in that kind of way, focusing on kind of, cool, more trendy styles. And then when did you started to pivot?
Yeah. So, I would say, tastes change and probably I think it was back in like 2018. So I've always been ironically, like I'm a fan of things that are bitter. I don't like sweet things generally. So the Barleywine seems a little a step away from that. But I think it was 2018, and we went to GABF, and I had the slow pour pills, you know, the beer stout beer.
Sure.
And at that point, I generally went to breweries and I wanted to try their best, like West Coast IPA and whatnot. And I had that Pilsner, and I was like, man, this is exactly what I want right now. It's perfect. Before I knew it, I had drank like 3 of them, you know, and it was like perfectly bitter and refreshing.
So that's at least, 25 minutes just
right.
in pour time.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, with the Hellas in between, right? While you wait on the beer.
Exactly.
And so when I came back from that trip. That was my inspiration was, all right, I need to figure out how to make a Pilsner like this. And we didn't really make much lager at the time because we didn't have a lot of tanks. And you know, I was like, I can turn a beer in 2 weeks. Why would I take 6 or 8 or longer, you know? But there's something to it. And so came back with that, and we developed our flagship house Pilsner called Crispy Whip, which we've designed to be kind of a blend between the things we like best of German and Czech Pilsners together. And so we wanted to do something a little bit different. So we had some Foeder crafters, like custom made 13-barrel horizontal Foeders, and we basically had them take their kind of egg shape and turn it on its side. So we wanted to like shorten the distance to clarify things faster, and so we do that. And it started out, it's kind of evolved over time. Early on, a lot of those beers had a noticeable, oaky component to them, and it's been a few years now. So now they're very, much more closer to what you'd call neutral, right? So you kind of get like, it just kind of rounds the edges of all the lagers we put through them in a way that's like, you kind of enjoy it for what's maybe not there versus what it's actually adding flavor wise. And so we've really been digging into that. And then I think maybe a year or 2 ago, we started really digging into doing decoctions on all of the lagers when we have a brew house that's not designed to do that at all.
Sure.
It's a 2-vessel brew house, but we reached out to some friends that we respected in the industry and to kind of see like how people were doing different ways of this process. And we found our way doing it. It makes for a long day, but we did it the first couple times and we said, this is kind of like a proof of concept for us. And then, we tried our Pilsner, and I was like, all right, well, I can't go backwards now. Yeah. So now, the brewers are like, great. Yeah. Now he's gonna just keep going down this path. So that's kind of where it started.
Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about the kind of mechanics of your, Foeder lager kind of setup, because you are also temperature controlling. I mean, at some point, all Foeder wood tank is similarly priced, a tank made of a slightly different material that, maybe is a little harder you can't throw glycol jackets on it or anything, but you can still temperature control it in different kinds of ways. And the density of that material is pretty good about maintaining, the massive temperature inside of the vessel itself. And so it's got its own insulating property to it too. And so in some senses, it's really just another tank with its own, after a while, without adding a lot of character to it. But I think it's interesting that you talk about the way that it can kind of smooth some of the edges there, especially as you work on some of these. So Elliot, I want to triangulate and go through kind of all of these pieces, both what the setup feels like or looks like, and then also how you design recipes to optimize for that kind of process. Let's talk about all of those things. But first, experience distinct transparency and juiciness with Omega Yeast's Daybreak 5. Using their Lumina technology, Omega genetically eliminated haze in the popular British 5 strain, allowing you to preserve the fruit-boosting prowess while achieving crystal clarity. It's perfect for modern West Coast IPAs. Learn more at info@omegayeast.com. And keep your brewery running smoothly with 5-star chemicals. Their cleaning solutions are specifically formulated to meet the unique needs of breweries, ensuring that your equipment stays clean and free of harmful bacteria and contaminants. From cleaning fermenters to kegs, they have a solution for every step of the brewing process. Use 5-star chemicals today and taste the difference in your brews. Also, RSS Macklin, a family-owned company started by the head of seaming technology from PS Angeles and SME, and a field service technician for Ball Corp, offers audits and repairs for can seamers and can integrity training. With experience from big breweries, they bring valuable knowledge to craft businesses. They provide solutions for can damage, seam training, and help your facility become self-sufficient without relying on original equipment manufacturers. If you have any questions regarding your machine setup, parameters, or concerns about your can line, call them at 330-299-8210 or email service@rssmacklin.com. That's RSSMACLIN.com. So talk to me about some of the kind of fundamental setup of foeders. You mentioned putting egg shaped on their side, which seems interesting to me, but then you also have worked on temperature control on those too.
Right. Yeah, and like you mentioned before, we basically treat them like a bright tank.
Yeah.
We don't actually ferment in our foeders.
Oh, okay. So primary still happens in stainless, and then they go condition in foeders.
Correct. Yeah. So our process is basically we ferment in stainless for approximately 16 days is what we are allotting. That gives us time to ferment and then step down fairly slowly, 2 to 3 degrees per day, and then we can push into the foeder. The foeder is actually
temperature do you want to be at when you go into that foeder?
So our foeders have cooling plates in them, right? And depending on the time of year, they can maintain temperature anywhere from 38 to 43 degrees. Right. And so our idea is to get our beer down to about 36 degrees before we push it in. And what that does is so we purge the foeder until we get below 5 parts per billion oxygen, to just like any other bright tank that we have. And then the concept is that there's going to be some dissolved CO2 in the beer. Even though we don't do, these beers are never spooned CO2 captured, because if you're going
hard to do that
if you're going to or even we could do it in the primary fermenter, sure, but then we're going to transfer it into a situation that has no back pressure and all, right, and you would just foam out you can't. So the idea being that, like, if you're starting colder like that, as the beer starts to warm from 36 up to 40 degrees, it's naturally just gassing off, and so it even provides extra protection against oxidation. So that's kind of the idea. And then we'll usually
slow, gentle off gassing that just creates a nice little CO2 blanket on there for you.
Right. And we basically, so we custom, most of their foeders are, in a normal size being, 7 or 10 or 15 or 20 or whatever. So we had them custom make ours to 13. And the thinking there was, we never got more than 12 and a half barrels into a bright tank in any beer we were making. Of course, this was several years ago. Now we've gotten a little better at things. So now we actually end up dumping some beer because we've evolved in that way. But we wanted to minimize the headspace, right? We didn't want like 15 barrel foeder, and then and the headspace in the bright tank is fine because you're under a bar of pressure. Right. But in this foeder, we're not able to pressurize them. So we basically fill them until the beer runs out of the top, and then we just sanitize the blow off pipe and keep it in there like that.
Yeah. And so you're double batching, I guess, you're off of a 7-barrel system to get into there. Correct.
Yeah. And that's the, so even our flagship Pilsner, that is what we sell the most of. So it's grown over the past couple of years quite a bit, but we're kind of at this point it's kind of capped, because it's like we can make what we can make as long as it's staying in the foeder, like that's what it is. And so it's basically going to take that amount of time to make those beers.
Sure. And so then within the foeder, talk to me about that aging process when it's in the foeder.
So and
I'm going to walk back and talk about recipe and everything else after this, but this is interesting to kind of set a groundwork, because this is your intention is now going into this and aging this way, and we'll back up and see what leads into that.
Correct. Okay. Yeah. So our standard time is we push in and we age for 4 weeks. And we experimented early on between 3 and 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And we found that to be a good time that allows some flavor to develop, allows some things to mellow also, but not like too long to slow down how long it makes to take the beer, but also like just the longer it's in oak, and even though we're doing everything we can to minimize any oxidation, I mean, the longer it's in there, the greater that chance becomes, right?
Sure.
So 4 weeks was kind of the magic spot. And so then we push out into a horizontal bright and give it 2 more weeks at like 30 degrees. So basically, and so that's, even though we're not spooning, we're putting head pressure on the tank in the morning and in the evening. And so it's being carbonated very slowly over 2 weeks. So you're still getting a nice, like tiny bubbles, nice foam structure in the beer. And then that's your 8 to 9 weeks approximately, start to finish.
Yeah. When you say oxidation, with the tank itself, there's no like pitch lining inside this foeder. It's oak surface.
Yeah, it's we have a light toast and a medium toast version, which, I mean, now I would say you can't really distinguish between the two of them anymore. But that was the idea originally, was just to see what the difference. And like in the first couple of dark beers we put through the medium toast were amazing. It was like this like marshmallow character that was so cool.
Right.
But it's not like I'm going to go back in and torch them again, So it's like, it was kind of, and that was kind of a fun thing over the first year or two, and we kind of talked about the process was this, this is going to evolve over time in different ways. Some ways you might like more, some ways you might like less. Some people might say, well, I wish that was oakier. And like, well, this is what it is. And so if you really want the beers that are super oaky, you get the first couple batches, and then, it's going to kind of, now, I mean, obviously if we really wanted to, we could add oak product and do that. But we really weren't after that.
Cubes or staves could still get you back to that character if you wanted it.
We really weren't after that. We really just wanted a way to give us another bright tank to allow us to brew, every couple weeks, but still have every batch, get plenty of time for conditioning.
Right. So it's a polishing process. This is just part of that kind of smoothing and aging that you want out of that lager. Described, and I imagine, again, because you're of the testing sort, that you have tested the same kind of lager in stainless steel and that aging versus that kind of that foeder process, even if it's not adding some of those wood flavor components, then there's still something that is providing for you. Describe to me, say the difference between when a beer goes in and it comes out, and then also that difference between, a beer spending a similar amount of time just sitting in a bright conditioning or lagering versus aging with this kind of micro oxidation potentially through that foeder.
Yeah. I mean, what we found is it really, formulation wise, the beers, especially if it's something Pilsner-ish, we're having to up the IBUs at least 5-ish to account for the mellowing that's happening. And so it kind of absorbs some of that and rounds some of those things off. And like we've done several beers we've done side by side because in one of the kind of, I guess you would say, downside to the fact that we have to double batch into these foeders is that now if we want to do that in one day, we're only going to be able to do a decoction on the first turn and do a step mash on the second turn, because otherwise, I mean, not many people are doing double batch decoction brewing because that, it's bad. It's enough for one, right?
I should listen to my episode that recorded with Andrew from Human Robot. He's talking about doing this. Anyway, it can be done, but you're right.
It's possible.
That's a long brew day for sure.
And so we've done it where we split the brews into 2 days if we really want to like get a double, triple decoction kind of idea. But we found like, especially like we've done our Pulatamave We've done it with and without, and people definitely, the Foeder version has, it is a little more, it's a little more mellow. It rounds a little. Our Poltsmave has a touch of pale chocolate, like, so it adds a little bit of a cocoa, like, because again, I'm always trying to balance. I don't really like things that are sweet, right? And so Poltsmave and it's, it's going to be that richer beer, and so I thought it was fun to see. I thought for sure people were going to, and so the single batch we were able to do a double decoction on just that single turn, and that's the beer that you're going to taste. And versus the other one, we could do our decoction and then the second version being step mashed. Most people in the taste room actually preferred the Foeder version, and the reason that the explanation I got from most commonly was just that it just felt like it was smoother.
Sure.
And not that's not the most descriptive term, but it's definitely, I think in the best lagers that you taste, having things that are in balance and rounded out are the best ones. Even when you're really trying to express a hop, you don't want the sharpness, and so I feel like that's
that
kind
best Czech lager is this nice round, intense, but also smooth kind of character, and all of that extra green matter actually helps build that kind of all the other pieces of that flavor without just adding a ton of bitters, right? But it's that integration and that kind of fineness is the term that the Czechs love to use, right? It's got to be fine, a fine bitterness, and then in a lot of sense, this is just a way to add some fineness into that process. Yeah,
and I mean, it's not the most efficient thing that we're going to add this extra bitterness and pay for the extra bittering hops or even noble hops or whatever we're doing just to account for them to be reduced. But you're still getting different parts of hops being expressed that way, so that's enjoyable for us.
Yeah. So I know obviously it's a long process for you to do this and tie up those tanks, so you have to find the value in doing it that way to continue justify doing it that way.
Yes, and it's definitely it's a much more labor intensive idea, right? So like when we empty a stainless bright tank, it's a very simple process the way that's going to be cleaned and prepared for the next beer. The Foeder is not. The Foeder is, there's no caustic, so it's a very labor intensive. So we've got to rinse the Foeder really well with hot water, and then all the ports have to be hand cleaned, which we hand clean the ports of the stainless tanks, but then we also have to hand clean the cooling plates inside.
Right.
Even though technically it has a spray ball we can put in it, but I didn't feel comfortable that the spray ball was going to be able to adequately clean that cooling plate every time.
Right.
And so in order to help me sleep at night, we wanted to hand clean it and visually inspect it, and then rinse we'll recirculate hot water, like 190 for an hour, dump that, and then we fill it with like 200-degree water and citric acid and let it sit overnight. And that basically just nukes anything that's in there. It's not the gentlest process on the oak, but it's the process that we developed. And it's also like, it made me feel very comfortable that we weren't having things that were going to dwell in the oak that we don't want. Right. And so that was kind of, so then we rinse that out and purge it with CO2 and get ready for the next one.
Do you find more leftover material in a Foeder versus, say, stainless? Is it pulling more out of the beer in some way, or is it a bit similar? I mean, it's hard to compare volume, I guess, since you don't have a convenient cone at the bottom of your Foeder to pull stuff off of.
I mean, I think it's comparable. I mean, it doesn't have the same amount of pressure. Obviously, if we're in the stainless tank, we have a little bit of we have the head pressure that's helping things fall out of the beer, and so it doesn't have that. But I find it to be pretty comparable, and then we're getting that after we come out in the stainless tank, we're getting that. But
right.
yeah, and
I
I
guess that refinement could go two directions. It could be less in the beer, but it could also be some things actually not leaving the beer. And either one of those could actually have that potential effect.
Right. And we don't, like I said before, we don't ferment in the foeders. So
right.
in the process, I mean,
it's
a pretty clean rack going in. There's definitely still yeast in there, 100%.
Right.
It's not clear going in there. You know what I mean? So it's in there, but it's not quite as much.
Is there any fining process to this at any point, or is it just time and temperature that does the work for you?
Yeah, no finings and no filtration. And that was also one of the things that drove us into the decoction method, was that we found that because of the manipulation of proteins and everything, that our beers were dropping brighter faster by doing that. And to me, even a cleaner, crisper flavor of the beer. And so that was part of it, and we also hear all of our, I wouldn't say 100%, but near that of our foeder lagers, we use at least 50% of it is a craft malt that's made here in the U.S. and the other 50% is generally going to be something that's Czech or German imported, so that we can kind of get the best of both, but also in incorporating the craft element to it. I found it to be even more important that we take steps to clarify the beer naturally with time and temperature and mash process and water chemistry and those things.
Interesting. Well, I want to talk more about that, because that actually echoes another conversation I did have recently. By recently, I mean yesterday. But and there is something to that. But I also love this idea of blending malts in order to both build an American craft idea and also pay homage to the origins of these styles. Let's talk a little bit more about that. But first, Indie Hops breeds new hop varieties to help brewers captivate beer lovers. Brewers worldwide trust Indie's unique varieties, Strata, Lorient, Luminosa, Meridian, and Audacia, to modernize, brighten, and diversify their beer lineup. Indie also offers classics that thrive in Oregon terroirs, such as Chinook, Crystal, and Sterling, thoughtfully crafted and selected hops to meet your brewing needs. Visit indiehops.com/podcast to discover what's new in hop flavors. Indie Hops, life is short. Let's make it flavorful. And Berkeley Yeast, founded by bioengineers, yeast that's designed to improve flavor, quality, and consistency, increase efficiency, and save you money. If you've been following yeast, I'm sure you've heard all about their strains. Super Bloom strains make classic hops flavors. Fresh strains keep diacetyl low, even with large hop additions. Tropic strains make a tropical bouquet, reminiscent of the finest Southern Hemisphere hops. And they just dropped new strains that are even more futuristic. Nationwide free shipping. Mention this podcast for 20% off of your first order. You created a natural segue, Eric, for us to dive back in and talk about recipe development on this. And so now that we know what that kind of end process looks like for you, let's go back to that kind of beginning. As you think about building a recipe for a Foeder Pilsner or Foeder Pils, whatever nomenclature you use for it.
Right.
Don't want to step on anyone's toes around this. Where did you start? You mentioned wanting to blend malt. Talk to me a little more about that.
Yeah. So we've for years, we've always wanted to. We have relationships with local, Virginia, North Carolina craft maltsters, and it's. I mean, I'm a big believer in it, just from the standpoint of it's helping a local economy, and not only that, but like you're getting. These guys will work with you if we want to customize things. We're getting malt that's super fresh all the time. It's not had to, go through the transit and everything. And so you can tell by chewing it that it's crisp and I think there's something to that. But there also are some things that, have been learned over hundreds of years that those elements don't need to be lost either. So like, I feel like we can get the best of both worlds, but you really have to be on top of looking at COAs and understanding the malt that you're using and developing a process around that. So when we first...
So tell me, from a food scientist perspective, someone who spent 20 years doing this kind of thing in the meat industry, you know, how did you think about doing that same thing and building this recipe?
Well, you know, it's early on, we didn't do a lot of like, it was rare. I never really asked for many COAs because I was just like, oh, this is a big malt company. They know what they're doing. They're going to send me a product that's to the spec that it's supposed to be. And I'm going to formulate my product around that. But, you know, in my previous life in the food industry, it was like, you didn't get a shipment of anything that didn't come with a COA, and someone was looking at every single one of them, you know, and they were making sure that everything was in specification. And, you know, what I found in that regard was when I worked for the really smaller, I worked for some multi-billion-dollar companies. I worked for some family-owned companies. And when you work for the family-owned company, if you're not paying attention, you're the one that gets the out-of-spec shit that, you know, they know you're not looking. And so once you start looking, then, you know, so being aware of what you're getting is important.
The squeaky wheel,
right,
and the oil and all that.
Yeah. And
right.
so, you know, that was, I think the first time that really hit home here was like our first decoction brew was actually, we weren't planning to do it beforehand when we scheduled the beer. We were just planning to use this Moravian origin Pils malt. And so we looked at the spec and we're like, oh, you know, it could be step mash, but a decoction would be helpful, but maybe not necessary. And then we looked at we asked for a COA just because by reading the descriptions of that, it made me a little nervous. I was like, all right, let's make sure we're getting this right the first time, because I want to do as much homework as possible before we really dig into something like that. And we saw that it was way under modified, you know, like, in a way with the glucan was off the charts, the protein was under modified, enzymatically, it wasn't where it needed to be. So, you know, and I reached out to the maltster and I was like, hey, you know, what is this? Like, why would I look at your spec and I look at the COA and it's like, and you send me the COA without any comment of, hey, this is like completely out of our own spec, you know, which I found to be disheartening. But anyway, we said, okay, well, we've got all this malt. We're not going to, they're like, well, we can replace it. You can order something else or whatever. I said, no, I've been wanting to do this for a while, but here's the little shove to make us do it, you know? So that resulted in like 3 weeks of being buried back into the textbooks of like, here's what we need to do, and here's how we're going to handle this malt. And so, and our process is, it's a 2-vessel brew house. So, we're not set up for that situation, but we developed a process that's not very complicated, where we basically just replace some valves and we can pump over into the kettle and pump back into the mash, and it works well enough. But, that was, we did a very, pretty complex process where it was only a single decoction, but we stepped quite a few through glucan, through a couple different protein rests, beta rests. And so the beer turned out, really nice, you know, and then we applied the same thing to our flagship, and we're like, okay, this is the way we're going to do things from now on. But it really opened my eyes to, whenever we're trying something new like that, to be on your toes.
What, when you describe what that mash and decoction, step mash and decoction regime, you know, how much different it tasted sensorially, like, you know, how would you describe that?
So we're a steam brew house, so we don't really get the direct fire, like the super rich Maillard development that you're going to get from that. But you do get flavor development in the boiling of the mash, because we're pulling full thick mash. We're not pulling out just liquid or anything. And so you get some nice, like, more intense malt flavors, I feel like. But that was my initial thinking before we did it, was that, why do this? Because scientifically, I can just temperature. I have steam jackets on my mash tun. If I want to get these set points, I can, you know, whatever. But to me, it was like that extra malt flavor, but also like this a finer, crisp, cleaner finish on it that I was not expecting so much for that to be noticeable to me. And so that's kind of what, then we're like, well, we can't unlearn this. So we're going to have to keep moving forward.
You're clearly manipulating the proteins in a way that also leads it to drop out brighter, as you mentioned earlier, at the end of the process. And so another benefit there too.
Yeah. And it's a tricky game too, because a lot of these older processes where they relied solely on decoction for temperature increase, these malts were super under modified. So you take a malt that's already been modified protein wise. Now you're going to overdo it. Right. And so it's really an understanding how you need to tweak your process to make it work for the malt you want to use. And I feel
so now you have to go get this out of spec malt that's highly under modified to repeat the process now that they've set the bar for you on that. Right.
And so that's a fun thing to do. And then we got another batch of it and like, oh, well, this one's in spec now. We're like, okay, well, then we'll do things a little bit differently and go back the other way, but still try to get the same finished thing. Yeah.
Sure. So what now, you blend craft malt and this all Pilsner malt, obviously, or is it? I guess I shouldn't assume.
It depends on the beer, right? So it's,
I was only thinking about Crispy Whip, but talk to me about that.
Well, even with Crispy Whip, we add some brew malt, which is kind of akin to like a honey or melloing malt.
Okay.
And then something that's a little bit of closer to like...
You're still decocting it, but also adding a a little flavor malt too. All right.
For sure. So,
cool.
Honestly...
a lot of Czech brewers do, so...
We did it originally, we were doing that before we were doing decoctions.
Right.
And so then what we started doing is now we actually have different mash bills. It's a double turn beer. We have a different mash bill for the decoction versus the step.
Oh, okay.
So in the decoction, we pull out, we have this closer to like we'll say a 40 SRM Lovabond. It's not really a caramel, but it has that some of those components to it. And we were adding that to the one that was being stepped. And then we found with the decoctions, like, well, it's too much. We don't need this in here. So we pulled it out, but we still have a little bit of what we're calling a brew malt. And it's adding, because we don't have the direct fire, it still adds a little bit. And it also really like the foam positive, the protein, the foam in the beer, it helps with that too. So like we still do it and it's also like we had a beer that is by far our best-selling draft beer. And so like, tread lightly on being like, hey, this is better. You're going to like this better. People like what they like, so change isn't always, that's not a objective thing.
I love that we're now at this nerdy place where you're brewing a similar recipe with modifications, one decocted, one step malted, both going into, primary, and blended together into this finished beer with, this is a nice and nerdy approach to lager brewing.
And honestly, like when we first did it, I was like, this is actually the perfect, because the original idea behind that beer was to meld these Czech components and German components. And so it kind of just made that a perfect division where we have this decocted like Czech mash, and then we're doing this more in-depth German style step mash on the second turn, and to where we were even early on, we were even taking, we're using German pills on the second turn and a Czech Moravian pills on the first turn. And so it's kind of a fun thing to play around with. Yeah.
That's great. That's crazy. So after the mash, talk to me about the rest of your hot side process. How do you, since you're blending German and Czech here, what does your approach to hops look like on these?
For like our flagship pills, it's still just a German Mittelfrüh hop is going to go in there. And that's part of that has to do with efficiency I'm just, I'm not one that loves, I want to add hops in increments of 5.5 or 11 or 22 pound. I don't,
Right,
unless
right.
it's bittering hops, because that way we have a certain equal number of batches that we're going to get out of bags of hops. And so it's like, I cringe when I'm like, somebody's, they're like, oh, we need to add, 3.1 pounds. And like, no, let's not do that. So we do that like for the house pills, but then otherwise we're doing more, various German noble hops for the German Pilsners and mostly COAs for the Czech beers.
Yeah. Anything novel or interesting to the addition process, or is it just pretty standard?
I don't think there's anything like super unique other than, so with the Germans, our kettle was designed without any sort of, we don't have a whirlpool vessel and we don't have a hop dam or anything. So if we put more than 5.5 pounds in a 7-barrel batch, our yield suffers significantly.
Yeah.
And we can offset that by brewing higher gravity, knowing that we can then dilute in the boil we just say, okay, well, we know we're going to lose this. It's fine because we've added extra volume. We've accounted for it. Right. But recently we actually had our kettle modified to had a hop dam welded in because we've been so happy with the results from the German pills and the West Coast IPAs and things where we're adding, 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds per barrel into the kettle. And we wanted to figure out a way to do that without losing so much liquid. And so I don't think that really makes anything super unique. We kind of got away from like the first wort hopping.
Yeah.
Mostly just because I'm kind of a control freak and like I want to know exactly what the pH of the beer is and everything before the hops are going in, and especially when we're doing so much experimentation with craft malt and different malt builds, and just gives me a little more peace of mind. So.
Sure. How about fermentation? What's your primary fermentation?
So we use a Munich lager yeast for all of them. We don't use any Czech lager yeast. We have once or twice, but again, it goes back to my need for making things efficient, right? And to my background, so it's kind of.
Is there a specific Munich strain there? Is it just a 3470?
No, it's a version of it's not 3470, but we get it from Jasper Yeast.
Oh, okay.
We've been working with them almost since the beginning. We used to use 3470 early on before we got the foeders. So used to be, we didn't make lagers frequently enough to keep a yeast alive, it's like we would just dry pitch, or we would find someone we could borrow yeast from, which now I don't, we don't want to do that. So we experimented with 3 or 4 different strains and settled on the one that we like, the most versatile. I'm not a huge fan of sulfur.
Okay.
So we wanted something that was going to be finished dry, and also still not have a lot of sulfur. And so, and my philosophy behind that is basically like, if I want to make Czech beer with German yeast, then it may not be like the most 100% authentic thing, but I can manipulate via mash, via water chemistry, via hopping, fermentation, everything else, to emulate those beers in a way that I feel like is our spin on it and delicious either way. So that's kind of our fermentation is, going to be, our yeast likes something in the 50, 51 range, not something, we can't go super cold, because if we do, we're going to end up with a sulfur bomb. We don't really want, it doesn't produce a lot of sulfur, but you still need a nice vigorous fermentation to get it out. So
yeah. Anything else particular or peculiar about the fermentation?
No, I don't. Nothing that's.
You said 16 days earlier, and generally, and then generally, what gravity are you then moving it over into a foeder at?
Yeah, so
or is that terminal or just close to terminal?
Oh no, it's definitely so like, the process is we hit terminal gravity, we clear, we do a forced VDK, we cleared for diacetyl, we don't have, we do that all organoleptically, so with a hot bath kind of situation. And once it clears, at that point, we start stepping it down to get from the low 50s down to that 36.
Yeah.
And so that's where we found that as long as we have healthy, good pitch of yeast, and we're doing cell counts on every time we do it, then it's going to, we shouldn't have any problem finishing fermentation in enough time to let us to bring it down slowly enough to be gentle on it and to then move it out. And so that's worked well for us. I mean, normally we can move it closer to 14 days, but we allow 16 or 17 just because, maybe there's a weekend in the middle, or maybe, one, if we're doing something a little bit, maybe the first gen might be a little bit slower, some kind of thing. So.
To wrap it up, when you pour that, and you do pour some of these off of Lucre taps here, and as well as in your Richmond tap room, how do you describe the beer? How do you think about it in a flavor way? How does that communicate? I mean, because you can say Pilsner or Pils or Pale Lager or whatnot, but there has to be some kind of character that you hang on to. How do you describe it?
So our house Pils Crisp Whip is it's not as hoppy, and it also makes it so it's a little more difficult to, like, let's say, put it into a competition of sort, because it's not really a German Pilsner and it's not really a Czech Pilsner. So you evaluate it as a German Pilsner and you think there's not quite enough hop punch to it, not quite enough like hop aromatics to it. And in the same way, and from the Czech side, it's not quite as rich malt wise as you might normally expect from that style. But to me, it has just enough of that where you get a little bit of like a toasty, bready character to it, and like a kind of doughy smell along with some of the nice like floral aromatics from the hops. But it still finishes quite dry. Like our attenuation on that beer is like 80%. So it still finishes quite dry, and I think it lends closer to like maybe the Southern German style of Pilsner, but a little bit more malt driven. If I was going to like describe it.
Sure.
But I think that's part of the reason why it's been so popular as a house beer, because it's not really aggressive in any one direction. It's almost like, I wouldn't say Helles-ish, but it's almost like it's more middle ground. So people are just happy to drink half liters of it.
Sure. Well, we should talk about Barleywine before we finish up here, because now we've just been talking a whole bunch about Foeder Lager, and we can see where your heart lies, and that's great. But let's talk about Old Wooden Ship. This is a 2023 Craft and Brewing Beer of the Year, barrel-aged barley wine. It's a project that you make every year, and you have a process behind it. Let's talk again about the process first, and then maybe walk back into the recipe that then feeds into that process.
Okay. So
I'm normally so linear about this, but I'm enjoying you shaking up my normal assumptions and my normal process, just because I think it's interesting to figure out where you're going and then map how you get there.
Right. Yeah. So the process for the barley wine is a double mash, and some years we double batch it, some years we don't. We've kind of gotten away from doing that because we
double batch, double mash. That's an extra long brew day.
It is intense. Well, we would do it. We would split it into 2 days.
Yeah.
And so the second day we would just knock out, and the beer would already be ripping, and we would just knock out straight into it. But what that meant is that we needed to package a decent amount of barley wine that was non-barrel aged, because I don't need the whole brewery filled with barrels of barley wine. So
I'm sure there's customers out there that just want, 13 and a half barrels of barley wine.
Right. Yeah. And so then, the non-barrel aged version, it's still very good. And we we used to can it occasionally. And I don't think we're going to do that this year. But yeah, it's basically, we're doing, the double mash, and then, during the first mash, we're boiling in the kettle while the second one's going in. And, and then when we're done, with the second mash, we'll boil for an extra 2 hours. So it gets roughly 3 hours, I would say, all in of boil. So not crazy, like not like the crazy, like overnight, situations that some people are employing, but enough to develop character in the beer.
Sure. Even though, as you mentioned, steam jacket and maybe not quite as much of that Maillard character, but some decent reduction in that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then that is typically aged in spirit bourbon barrels that have previously aged one of our stouts. And sometimes we'll do some that haven't previously aged any beer and blend those back together to get the right finished product.
So then let's talk about recipe then. So
like I mentioned before, like the inspiration of the beer was something. It is an English barley wine, but it's a little darker than most, I would say.
That is the current trend these days, these blended or dark barley wines, black barley wines.
So ours is, it starts with floor malted maris otter. The crisp, the number 19 floor malted is probably one of my favorite all-time malts. And it's, you could honestly make the beer with just that, and it would be phenomenal.
Yeah.
But we like to add in some like double roasted crystal and a little bit of pale chocolate, and so that kind of gives it that little kind of Dutch cocoa kind of component to the beer that makes it so it doesn't finish quite so sweet. It's not really aggressively bitter by any means, just enough to kind of try to balance it out. And then
English hops.
No, there's not any English hops in it. No, it's all just it's just a clean bittering charge.
Okay,
basically,
yeah.
We don't even bother with a whirlpool because it's the way
it's
I
like
feel.
A Magnum or Warrior then, or
yeah, Magnum and we've been playing with like some. This year we've been playing with this new Helios.
Oh yeah,
and so we might try bittering with that this year because it really doesn't. To me, it's like. You just want the balance, and when you're gonna let it sit in a barrel for a year, like I don't know, I'm not gonna spend money on aroma hops, right? So it's like, what's the point?
Yeah.
But and that's kind of so it's all English malt, but then
yeah. And then sorry, through this. What's your, obviously the idea of barley wine is, a high gravity beer. Where do you start? Where do you hope to finish? And then, and how do you build this idea, that it needs to finish, it needs to feel luxurious, but it also can't just be so plush that you lose yourself and can't get out of it.
Right. And so we're targeting around 31, 32 Plato starting.
Okay.
Which also makes yeast selection important.
Sure.
Because that's a big beer. And so then it'll finish before going into the barrel. It's usually going to be sitting in the like mid 12s, I'd say, percent, not Plato.
Yeah.
So, but it doesn't. That floor malted maris otter is a pretty. We've got a pretty long. Not only is it double mash, but the conversion step has to be longer too, because it's a little more under modified with the floor malting process, and so, but it also leaves a little bit of extra body in the beer, which is I think one of the things that makes it special. So.
It's not necessarily perceived as sweetness, but just feels like body.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is trying to get something that can balance all those components of the rich malt, but not, not bitter and a little bit, I think a little bit of the roast really helps put an edge on it.
Yeah. So fermentation, obviously, is a tricky and particular thing. How do you proceed with that?
So we just have a large pitch of healthy yeast that can handle that alcohol content. And actually, we used to brew it with Hornindal Kveik yeast.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it surprisingly, I mean, because it loved the 30 Plato, where it had no problem. We just rip right through it, and we would ferment it at like 90. And we did it on a single batch one time because I was like, I'm not sure how this is going to turn out, but it actually turned out super clean and even, but I feel like we got away from it because the mouthfeel was almost a little bit too much, like because the Kveik yeast has the kind of more creates even at a higher attenuation, it creates more like with lipids, like the mouthfeel of it, right? And so now we kind of will go more in the realm of like an American or Scottish yeast, something like that.
Yeah. But it's not the same yeast all the time. Sometimes you're mixing it up a little bit.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that's going to be, we just make sure that whatever we're going to use, it's usually not a yeast that we are using in the brewery regularly.
Right.
So
and it will not be used after that batch either. So, yeah.
So we're always planning it out to where we can at least brew one beer before that to step it up so that we're not just like murdering the yeast, dumping it in that 30 Plato. So we'll brew a smaller beer, and harvest off that and then we're ready.
Yeah. Well, then, so then fermentation is fermentation, and then, you throw it into barrels.
Yeah. So we'll put it in barrels and age it for a year. We used to actually 6 months in top it up. So we would keg off some of it still, and then we would use that to top up 6 months in. Mm-hmm. But we actually gotten away from that because I feel like we developed a little more flavor not doing that. A little bit more oxidation of the beer. Not in a big way, but and it also is, it's not a tough sell for me and the other brewers to say, hey, you can just let that barrel sit there.
Right. You don't have to do all this extra work.
You don't have to pull this thing down, because we did it the first year and we're like, all right, let's try this without topping it up, and we actually thought it made the beer better. And that also, what gave us the original idea was, like I think I mentioned before, was where every year for our anniversary, we tap a keg of the previous years. And we were like, this little bit of extra time is making this beer even better, even after aging it for a whole year. And so that's kind of where we, and actually last fall, we didn't make it because we had we wanted to see what 2 years in the barrel is like. So this year's batch that we're going to be packaging has been in the barrels for 2 years.
Huh.
So
extra long age. Well, I can't wait to try that once you
excited about that.
Send some of that our way. Well, can't wait to taste it. And then how do you finish it? What's obviously these are carbonated pretty low in order to let that kind of richness come through. Yeah,
they are, but I think that is one thing that people generally comment on with our barley wine, is that it is carved a little higher than probably a lot of others are. So we're in the mid 2.4s, high 2.4s, 2.47, under 2.5 generally. But that's not typical from my experience. But I feel like it's one of those beers that the balance is so important. And so having and we have pretty nice foam on the beer too, which is also not necessarily always the case with this style of beer. But I think it makes it just more drinkable. It's not like you're going to crush pints of it, but it does make it a little more enjoyable to me to have that little that I wouldn't say it's like carbonic bite. It's not like a highly carb beer, but
Sure.
just a little bit more, make it a little more lively.
Adds some of that kind of structure and balance, in that picture. That brought back another question I had earlier that didn't get into you. When you mentioned that foam, I'm thinking about Foeder lager, you think about foam potential in a beer, and that kind of environment being one where, as you say, as soon as foam breaks out, then your foam potential is gone in there. And so you have to have an extra careful process about making sure that there's no nucleation points, that you're not breaking foam out at any point of that kind of Foeder process. Sorry, I'm distracting. I'm going off in a whole other direction here.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, that was something that the first batches we made, we capped the fermenter a little too soon. And so we were foaming a little bit more than we wanted to going into the Foeder. But so now after the first batch, the head pressure never gets above like 2 PSI in the fermenter. So we keep it low. We're really trying to minimize. Right. We want, we want some dissolved CO2 in the beer just for protection. Right. But we're wanting to minimize that and keep, and it's a gentle process. I mean, we takes about an hour to transfer 12, 13 barrels into the Foeder, whereas normally, I mean, that process is much faster for that volume of beer when you're pushing with CO2. So that's same thing coming out. Actually, coming out of the Foeder is more challenging than going into it, right? Because we don't want to pressurize it. We push with CO2, but it has to be the perfect amount that the Foeder doesn't want to draw a vacuum, but we also aren't pressurizing it. So that took a little trial and error to make sure that we're only putting in the amount in the headspace that allows the beer to keep moving, no more, no less, right? And so that's another reason why the Foeders, especially in the first 6 months, kept me up at night, because it was just always thinking about all those details. And it's also something that it's a lot more challenging to train and develop these processes that are super robust and train people on how to do them versus just you can go from brewery A to brewery B, and most people a good cellarman you can come in and say, hey, clean that horizontal, and there might be some differences in your cleaning protocol, but it's not drastic, or transfer this beer where this is something that there's no books written on this, right? So it's when we first did it, it's there wasn't really anyone to lean on. It was just develop what works for you, and that's what we've done. So
yeah, with the background of a food scientist and a process-oriented mind around all of this. Well, let's zoom out as we finish up here. You've with Benchtop, you've that's about 8 years or so now, 7 or 8 years. You've got 2 tap rooms, one here in Norfolk, one in Richmond. You've now found a style that you just love making and your customers love from you, as well as a whole bunch of other styles too. It's definitely a community brewery, more so than a tightly style focused brewery. What do you hope to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years? Where do you see Benchtop going in the next 3 to 5?
Honestly, we just hope to keep growing and evolving in the way that we make beer, right? We're at full capacity right now in our brewery. And it used to, I used to have the goal of, we want to build a new big production brewery and do all of that. But now we're not so much right. That seems like more risk than I want to take. Right. Sure. I'm happy with figuring out ways to make the beers that we make better and continue to learn along the way and provide, unique experiences in our tap rooms. And we distribute, we're about 50-50 distribution versus tap room. And so hopefully we can just continue to organically kind of grow that. Not really like a huge footprint necessarily, but really maybe look at another location, but if eventually, but tell my wife that, this conversation never happened. So
your secret is safe with all of us.
Yeah, that's right. Sure. But that's kind of the where things have evolved in my mind. It's like not trying to produce more beer, just produce better beer. And so that's that also keeps me engaged with the process.
Right.
Where it's like, yes, it can be a challenge to scale up and make things bigger and reach farther, but it's actually more fulfilling to spend your time making things better.
For sure. Well, that's a great place to bring this to a close. Choose G&D Chillers on your next expansion or brewery startup and receive 1 free year of remote control and monitoring. ProBrew offers 2 to 4 week lead time on in-stock rotary can fillers and seamers. Old Orchard is your go-to source for fruit-forward ingredients for some of the biggest names in the craft brewing landscape. Omega Yeast Daybreak 5 gives you juicy modern hop flavors without the haze. 5-Star Chemicals cleaning solutions are specifically formulated to meet the unique needs of breweries. Take back control of your canning and seaming with the experts at RSS Macklin. Trust Indie Hop's unique varieties to modernize, brighten, and diversify your beer lineup. And Berkeley yeast strains are designed to improve flavor, quality, and consistency. If you've enjoyed this episode, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button. We've got our new Best in Beer issue that we are working on avidly right now. That's going to be out in mid-November this year. In fact, November 14th is when we're going to drop that one. And you will see, just as Eric did with Benchtop last year, who wins our finds their way into our editor's picks for our 20 best beers of 2024. But you need to be a subscriber to get it the day and the moment and the minute that it releases, because it goes out via PDF to everyone at the same moment. Eric, if people want to learn more about Benchtop, where do they find you?
We have 2 locations, one in Norfolk, Virginia, and one in Richmond. We also have benchtopbrewing.com, their website, and we have an online shop there that you can find beers that are currently available. Instagram at Benchtop Brewing, and our Richmond is at benchtopbrewing_RBA. So you can check out all of the fun content there as well.
Still bottles of Old Wooden Ship here in the tap room for sale. So, you can still come get some, and then you'll have a new release out the next few months too. So
yeah, it's our 8th anniversary is coming up quickly approaching, which is mid-November, and so we'll have the new versions and available then.
Awesome. Well, it's been wonderful to pick your brain about Foeder Lager and about Barleywine. Thanks.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.